On the surface, the story of MadeinTYO seems like one that we've heard time and time again, of a young artist who discovered the SoundCloud platform, dropped a couple tracks on there, only to have one of them be so catchy that it caught fire and blew them up into the mainstream. And once they reached that mainstream level, they were given every opportunity that a rising star could possibly want, including big time features, production from the best producers in the game, as well as many shows with many big venues. However, most of the time the rapid rise is followed by a rapid fall. Most of the guys who were big during the SoundCloud era were not able to maintain their relevancy, and the way that they fell off is very well documented. And whenever one of these massive SoundCloud rappers fall off, it always seems to be blamed on one factor, whether it's Lil Xan dissing Tupac on an interview, or Smoke Perp getting beat up by Russ and his goons, or 6ix9ine snitching on his gang. It always seems to be one factor that leads them to their end. However, this is where MadeinTYO really differs from the rest of the pack, because while his rise to fame was definitely pretty rapid, he was actually able to maintain his relevancy for quite a few years while also somewhat fading into the background, which kind of leaves you with the feeling that he was here one moment, basically a staple of the rap game, and then the very next, nobody was talking about him anymore. But why? What led MadeinTYO to eventually fall into irrelevancy? Well, I'll tell you when we talk about the story of MadeinTYO. Malcolm Jamal Davis was born April 12, 1992 in Honolulu, Hawaii, to two military parents as the youngest of two brothers, and because of that, he would spend a lot of his early life bouncing from one military base to another. Now, the exact order of places that the family bounced around to isn't very clear, but we do know that they were stationed in Oakland, California when Tokyo's older brother, Royce Rizzy, was born, before then moving to Hawaii so MadeinTYO could be born, then to Texas, DC, Maryland, and well, many more places. Probably not in that order though. But either way, you would think that would make the two of them pretty isolated kids. I mean, after all, they never really had a place to call home, they were never in one spot for too long, meaning they couldn't make lifelong friends, and because of that, they probably felt like they never really belonged. But surprisingly, when a kid moves around a lot in their early years, they seem to become more outgoing than closed off, which I wouldn't really expect, but considering the fact that you probably have to constantly reintroduce yourself to new people, you probably learn that skill, which would help them later on in life. And on top of being very outgoing kids, they also would constantly live on military bases, meaning that basically everybody in that area knew who they were through their family, and because of that, MadeinTYO was able to get his first ever job at the base's grocery store when he was only 12 years old. Now, immediately you're probably thinking that's way too young for a kid to be working an 8-hour shift, but he wasn't actually getting paid for it, instead only getting paid in tips, and because everybody knew who he was, he would often take home $100 a day. And having access to that much money at that age really put him ahead of all of his classmates because he was able to buy the newest clothes, the freshest CDs from all of his favorite rappers, and most importantly, the newest skateboards. Because that's basically what MadeinTYO was doing all throughout his childhood, going to the local skate parks, getting to know people, working on his moves, with hopes that he would eventually become a professional skater. But that's just Tokyo. When we're looking at the full story of his come up, we really do have to look to his older brother Royce Rizzy, because he's really the one who ended up setting up all of the dominoes that Tokyo would eventually knock down later in his career. Because while Tokyo definitely did enjoy rap music, listening to people like 50 Cent, Big Sean, and Pharrell, he wasn't as dedicated to it as his older brother. Because while Tokyo was fucking around at the local skate parks trying to learn how to kickflip, Royce was trying to make music since the time that he was 12 years old. With him originally getting his start by doing karaoke, before then going over to his cousin's house and seeing that he had his own home studio, inspiring him to create his own. With him immediately coming home and taking all of the stuff out of his bedroom, including even his bed, telling his parents that he was willing to sleep on the floor if it meant that he could have a studio at home, and that's exactly what he would do. And you gotta keep in mind that he was doing all of this around 2007. So there wasn't YouTube to download beats on or upload your music, there wasn't SoundCloud, in fact there probably wasn't even SoundClick yet. So Royce was doing it the old-fashioned way, going on LimeWire, finding beats, then recording his vocals over them, burning it on a CD, and then bringing it to school for people to listen to. And surprisingly, he was incredibly successful at this, selling over 70 CDs by the end of the school year, inspiring him to continue to create music. Now unfortunately, we can't listen to the type of music that he was making at the time because, well, it would be on a crusty old old CD from over a decade ago. But to be only 14 years old and have over 70 of his classmates interested in buying his music on CD either means that he was very charismatic or secretly very talented. And the creation of all of this music would actually help Royce to become much more popular in school, with him eventually taking TOKIO under his wing and making him very popular as well, which only made it sting more when their parents told them that they would be moving once again, but this time not to a different state in America, but a whole nother country, being Japan. And of course this would be pretty devastating for them, as Royce was already halfway through high school and TOKIO was about to enter freshman year, meaning that they were about to be in their formative years, and being in an entirely different country with a different culture really didn't appeal to them. However, despite how much they didn't want to go to Japan, once they actually got there, Royce would become much more successful than he ever was in America, with him immediately discovering a poster for a touring manager at a local store and hitting him up. And considering there wasn't many local rappers in that area at the time, the guy actually decided to give Royce a chance, and after he ended up opening up for a couple small acts in the area, the two of them would form a connection that would continue on throughout the rest of his high school years. And these small time shows that he was opening up for would eventually lead him to even bigger opportunities, eventually opening for 3-6 Mafia when they did a show in Japan, which had to be absolutely mind-blowing. He also says that he was getting articles written about him all the way back in 2007, but of course I'm not able to find those anymore, as the way the internet works, a lot of stuff is lost to history or just very difficult to find unless you know exactly what you're looking for. But I do believe him, and honestly, considering the fact that he was only 17 years old at the time, it goes to show that he was really starting to gain a buzz. However, unfortunately, you can't find any music released by Royce Rizzy prior to 2011, most likely due to the fact that it was all probably burnt onto CD and is now completely lost unless you somehow have one of those from back in the day, which is pretty common for any rapper who was releasing music prior to 2010. It wasn't really until the new decade when people realized how beneficial the internet could actually be for spreading their music around, so he only really started dropping music on there in 2011. However, before I get to that era, I have to talk about one more show that he ended up doing in Japan, where he ended up opening for an artist going by the name of Little Scrappy, who would eventually change both of the brothers' lives forever. Now, while people don't talk about him as much nowadays, back in the late 2000s, Little Scrappy was actually a pretty big name in the southern hip-hop scene, as well as Don Cannon also being a pretty big name. So when the two of them ended up going to Japan to do a show, Royce knew that he finally had an opportunity to get connected to some pretty big time names. So after the show was over, he would wait around backstage with hopes of talking to them. And while Little Scrappy was initially pretty dismissive of him, Don Cannon was actually pretty interested to hear him rap, asking him to spit a freestyle. And after he did, Little Scrappy was actually so impressed that he would also spit a freestyle. The two of them would go back and forth, bar for bar, and when it was all said and done, Little Scrappy would tell Royce that if he was ever in Atlanta, he could do something for him. With him not promising that he could turn Royce into an overnight star, but telling him that he had so many connections in Atlanta that if he decided to come down, he could definitely get him in some spots that would put him in a better position when it came to his career. So as soon as high school was over and he was no longer bound to his parents, he would immediately move down to Atlanta to try to take his career to the next level, which meant that he left TOKIO behind to finish out his own high school experience. Now, the exact years on this can be a little bit confusing, but seeing as how Royce was born in 1990, it meant that he must have graduated in 2008, and then he spent one more year in Japan so he could really take in the culture, meaning that he probably moved to Atlanta around 2009 or 2010. And then TOKIO was born in 1992, so he would have graduated in 2010, and then he also spent another year in Japan to take in the culture, meaning that he probably ended up moving to Atlanta around 2011. In a couple interviews, TOKIO talks about how he was on a 6-year grind before he really blew up, and considering that he blew up in 2015, that would mean that he really got started in 2009. Either way though, doesn't really matter. Eventually both of the brothers ended up in Atlanta. Oh yeah, and real quick before we get into it, I want to explain how they both got their names. I mean, with MadeinTYO, it's pretty obvious. He lived in Tokyo, and then he thought it was clever to say Made in Tokyo. Very impressive. And then you got Rolls Royce Rizzy, which is very difficult to say for some reason. Basically, his name came from the fact that when he was younger, everybody would call him Rizzy, which probably meant something very different than what it means nowadays, but he was very inspired by Kanye West, with him always giving himself nicknames on every track that he would put out, so he also decided to give himself a nickname, which of course would be the name that I said before that I'm not going to repeat because it's way too hard to say. Now, as 2011 kicked off, Rizzy was really able to get his foot in the door in the industry, with him spending a lot of his time hanging out at the label Disturbing the Peace, which of course was started up by the legendary rapper Ludacris, which is actually the very same label that he was signed to, which if you don't know, that's Destroy Lonely's dad. So as you can see, everything's connected, 7 degrees of separation, but yeah, Royce wasn't really signed to them, but he was able to get a behind the scenes look of how labels were run, which would help him out a lot in his later career when he started up his own. As 2011 continued on, he would mostly work with Lil Scrappy and Don Cannon, before then becoming acquainted with Wiz Khalifa in 2012. Now, I'm not really sure how the two of them met, but they do seem to be pretty close friends, with them even doing an interview together at one point. He also ended up opening for him at a couple shows, as well as dropping his first two mixtapes called Y'all Sleep and God Got Me. Now, they're probably not his first ever mixtapes, but they are the first two that were actually posted online, showing that he was starting to move into the internet age. However, it was really 2013 when he started to take off in a big way in Atlanta, dropping a track called Goddamn, which quickly gained 500,000 views on YouTube alone, as well as being played at all the clubs all over the city. So basically, a regional hit. Now, these still exist to a certain extent nowadays, but if a song ends up getting big enough in one city, it will eventually start to cross over and get mainstream attention on the radio. But back in the day, it was definitely possible that you could only be known in one city and never really go beyond that. And unfortunately, that's where Royce kind of found himself. But if you have to be big in only one city, Atlanta is definitely the place you want to be, and he would immediately capitalize off the success that he was gaining from the song by dropping a remix which included K-Camp, Twista, and of course, Lil Scrappy. And in fact, at one point he actually wanted to take it to the next level by dropping a 20-minute remix with a bunch of different rappers from all over the city, but apparently Lil Scrappy told him not to do that. And with all this newfound fame that he gained from his hit song, he was kind of on the level that Stitches was in 2015 when he dropped Brick in Your Face, basically being big enough in the city that he could do walkthroughs, meet and greets, small time shows, and make a lot of money off of that, although he wasn't really growing outside of that base. And as minimal as all of that might sound, that's definitely still a lot of money. He was probably making at least $300 for every show that he was doing. He was doing multiple shows a week, so he was definitely making a pretty healthy bag. And I know you're probably asking, wasn't this supposed to be a Made in Tokyo video, not a Royce Rizzy video? What was Tokyo doing when all of this was going down? Well, he was actually sitting in at all of his brother's studio sessions and writing down his own lyrics with hopes that he would eventually be able to hop on a song with him and blow up in his own way. But at the time, he wasn't really all that interested in making his own music, instead writing hooks for other rappers as a ghostwriter that he could then sell for $300, and surprisingly, he was very successful at this and he would make a lot of money doing so. So at this point in 2014, both of the brothers seemed to be doing pretty well, although unfortunately, Rizzy would start to see that he hadn't really managed to build up a very solid fan base off of the music that he put out, and was mostly seen as an industry plant that was being put on by more successful artists, which meant that he had to put in more work if he really wanted to build a base. So he would take the opportunity to sign to a major label going by the name of So Def, a decision that he would later go on to regret, but at the time seemed to be a pretty wise one, with him immediately setting off on his first headlining tour, which was called My Crazy Life. Although this wasn't all over the country, it was only at places in Atlanta, so it wasn't really a big time tour, although he would get to be an opener on Wiz Khalifa's Black Secret Hollywood tour, which was definitely a lot bigger of an opportunity for him, with him actually getting to briefly interact with people like Kendrick Lamar, Ty Dolla $ign, and well, apparently even Drake. However, even with all these seemingly big opportunities that he was gaining, his career really started to stall out around this time, with the label not doing a whole lot to back him up or try to push him to that next level. Not to mention, he was also being sued by Rolls-Royce, once again very hard to say, I don't know why it's so hard to say, with them of course being upset that he was using their name and likeness to promote his own music, trying to sue him for $500,000, even though he wasn't all that big of an artist in the first place and definitely didn't have that type of money. At first, he wasn't really taking this lawsuit all that seriously, as after all, it's a massive company and they probably don't care that much about an artist like him, but surprisingly, they were incredibly adamant about trying to get him to stop using the likeness, and they would hand him a cease and desist at absolutely every show that he would do, and it was getting to the point that it was becoming a little bit ridiculous. However, despite that, he was able to hold on to the name throughout the rest of 2014 and most of 2015 before finally changing it in 2016, but it had to be a pretty big blow to his career considering the fact that he had built up this name over the course of half a decade and now was no longer able to use it anymore. And at this point, you would think he would pretty well fall off. I mean, the label's not pushing him anymore, he's no longer able to use the name, and it seems like this would have been the rise and fall of Royce Rizzy. But luckily for him, his little brother had a bigger vision, because he would immediately pitch the idea of the two of them starting up their own private label slash rap group known as Private Club, where basically they would take on rappers that they were friends with or that they thought were talented and then try to blow them up. And while initially Royce didn't want to do this, he would eventually relent and decide to start up this label label with them, with the two of them pushing it heavy throughout the rest of 2014 and 2015. And it was also on October 26, 2014 that Tokyo would drop his first ever track on SoundCloud, going by the name I Hate Yourself, which had a feature from SZA. Now, I'm not sure if this was a real feature or if he maybe faked it, but maybe SZA wasn't that big back then? Not really sure. I feel like I'm being trolled here. I feel like I'm gonna get 1,000 comments of people saying, "You stupid fuck, do you really think that SZA would have worked with MadeinTYO all the way back then?" And to that I say, maybe. I mean, I don't really know how big SZA was in 2014, and she was actually recently posted on the Private Club YouTube channel, so maybe they really do have a connection. It could be a real feature, it could be fake. Either way though, doesn't really matter. The song didn't really do numbers. After that, in 2015, Royce would drop 2 more projects going by the name of Pre-Rolled in 24 Hours, which ironically would actually become his rap name in 2016. However, neither one of these projects really pushed the needle when it came to his success, and he was really starting to fall off at this point. However, even though he wasn't doing well in the mainstream, his SoundCloud account was still pushing pretty good numbers. As at this point in 2015, the app was starting to gain more and more momentum. I mean, people have been posting music on there as far back as 2012, but it wasn't really until the mid-2010s that it became a viable platform that people really posted music on seriously. And especially in Atlanta, it was becoming a massive deal, with people like Lil Yachty, Playboi Carti, Uno the Activist, and Thousand Band Fawny all starting to blow up off of the platform and getting their music played in the local strip clubs. So now was the perfect time for Tokyo to capitalize off of this trend and start dropping music that fit the tone. Although unfortunately, his own SoundCloud account really wasn't gaining a lot of traction. So instead, he would ask his brother if he could post one of his own songs on his SoundCloud. Now, once again, Royce didn't really want to do this, as after all, he was dealing with a lot of label troubles. He was starting to lose a lot of his audience with them being conflicted about his new sound, so putting a random track from his little brother on SoundCloud didn't seem like a good idea. But once again, Brother of the Year, he decided to do so. And that very same year in May, Tokyo would drop his real big breakthrough hit known as I Want. Now, I'm really not sure what it was about this song that made it so popular. I'm not sure if it was in the right place at the right time. I'm not sure if it was because Royce was so tapped into Atlanta that a lot of people were listening and this new sound really surprised them, so they shared it around, or maybe they got lucky. Sometimes when it comes to algorithms, there's really no method behind the madness. You truly just get lucky, and that's exactly what ended up happening with this song, with it gaining over 500,000 plays in only a couple weeks time. And immediately he would get posted on Complex, Fader, World Star Hip Hop. Basically everybody was taking notice of MadeinTYO, so he would immediately capitalize on that by making a music video for the track. And just like the song before it, this music video would do very well on YouTube, gaining 500,000 views and gaining him a massive fan base in Atlanta. But it was the next song that he would drop that would really break him through. A song that you probably already know about and have heard many times throughout your life, going by the name of Uber Everywhere. Or maybe you haven't, because honestly, I never really realized this was one of his biggest songs. I mostly knew him through Skateboard P, but well, we'll get to that when we get to it. For right now, let's talk about his first real big hit outside of Atlanta. This track would drop only 2 months after the prior one in August, with it immediately gaining 1 million views on YouTube before then getting 2 million and even entering the Billboard Hot 100. This would gain it enough attention to be played on radio stations in major cities, only gaining it more attention. Everybody who was riding around in Ubers were of course playing the song, and overnight MadeinTYO was becoming a massive star. However, it's important when we mention the success of this song that we don't only pin it on Tokyo, because there's also the producer of the track, KSwisser, who definitely gave the song a lot of its magic. Now, these two actually didn't know each other before the song dropped. It just so happened that MadeinTYO found the beat on YouTube, decided to use it, and then, well, it became massive. And after that, of course, he had to reach out to KSwisser, because a lot of times people will find YouTube beats, make a song that blows up, and then the producer's coming after them for royalties. But it seems like MadeinTYO was a nice enough guy that he actually ended up reaching out to Swisher before Swisher reached out to him. And the two of them would actually continue to work together, dropping 2 more songs going by the name of Taking Off and Leftovers, which, while never getting as big as Uber Everywhere, definitely did some pretty decent numbers. And then surprisingly enough, MadeinTYO would actually take a page out of Kamiyata's book by dropping a song called Need That Pack, which had 3 different remixes with 3 different producers. One by a guy named Novelist, who I've never heard of before, before, one by Mexico Dro, who was mostly known for working with Playboi Carti and Splur Gang, and one with Icy Chwat, which of course became the biggest of the three because at that point, Icy Chwat was already a legend. And while all these songs did pretty good on SoundCloud, I think everybody was waiting for the next big hit to drop from Tokyo, but that wouldn't come until the following year of 2016. Now, if 2015 was the launchpad for SoundCloud rap, 2016 is really where it started to find mainstream attention. I mean, there were a couple guys who were getting big in the prior year, but it was really 2016 when SoundCloud took off, and MadeinTYO was primed and ready to be one of those guys who really took advantage of that. With him and his brother, now renamed to 24 Hours, immediately dropping a project together on January 1st of 2016, going by the name of Made in Murda. And while this project isn't really all that important in the grand scheme of his career, I do think that it's kind of cool that he was still showing love to his brother and not leaving him in the dust, as after all, he wouldn't even be where he was if it wasn't for him. That project was then followed up in February by him doing an interview on Hot New Hip Hop before then heading off on a tour with Private Club, which went from February to around June. This included shows at South by Southwest, a Lyrical Lemonade show, which was actually the first ever Summer Smash, as well as a show in LA, which was heavily covered by No Jumper. And you would think with him being so close to No Jumper, he would definitely drop in for an interview, but surprisingly, Tokyo was one of very few artists from that era that never decided to do a No Jumper interview. 24 Hours ended up doing one, which was definitely pretty cool, but Tokyo never showed up, which is something that he would go on to regret later in his career. With him instead, for some reason, taking a bunch of interviews with radio stations, which I do kind of understand why he did, because after all, by the time he blew up, he was around 24 years old, so he was a little bit older and was more familiar with how classic hip-hop kind of ran things, although at this point in 2016, radio stations were becoming more and more irrelevant, and places like No Jumper, Mass Appeal, and World Star Hip Hop were becoming a lot bigger. And while I'm not going to sit here and say that this hurt his career overall, I definitely feel like it kind of made him seem like he wasn't really super attached to the overall SoundCloud wave. I mean, at this point, SoundCloud wasn't only an app anymore, it was becoming a culture. And I'm not even talking about the face tattoos or the drug use, I'm more so talking about the fact that there was just certain things that SoundCloud rappers did that MadeinTYO didn't really seem all that interested in. I mean, most people would do the No Jumper podcast, they would go on to do a Mass Appeal interview, and then they would get a Lyrical Lemonade video. A lot of these guys were really on the ground floor of LA, trying to be part of the wave, doing local shows, whereas MadeinTYO, I think because he was a little bit older and he got into the wave very early on, wasn't really interested in being part of all of that. Which is a trap that a lot of these guys fell into. I mean, I don't ever remember hearing about people like Uno the Activist back when the SoundCloud wave was really at its peak, because he was really only big in Atlanta and he never really tried to integrate himself into the overall wave. And I think Tokyo falls into a similar box. He would eventually get on board with a lot of this stuff, but it would come a little bit too late. However, for right now, things were going amazing. I mean, after all, Uber Everywhere had reached number 51 on the Billboard Hot 100, it had gone platinum in record time, and it seemed like Tokyo was only going to get bigger and bigger. However, for some reason, Fader wasn't willing to post him again unless it was for a music video or a project, and while he definitely had music videos at this point, I guess he felt like it was more worthwhile to put together an entire mixtape and drop that on the platform, and that's exactly what he ended up doing, taking all of his priorly recorded music and putting it together, dropping his first ever mixtape that wasn't with his brother called Thank You Mr. Tokyo. And this project included his next big viral hit going by the name of Skateboard P, as well as him getting a remix by 2 Chainz on his song I Want, which of course gave that song a second win. This project was then quickly followed up by another one in August, which was called You Are Forgiven, which included both a remix of Uber Everywhere featuring Travis Scott, as well as Skateboard P getting a remix featuring Big Sean, which is where this song really ended up taking off. And while surprisingly Skateboard P would never hit the Billboard Hot 100, it would end up going platinum in only a couple months' time, giving him 3 platinum records in only a year. Not to mention with big name features like this, it definitely seemed like he was only going to get bigger and bigger. He would then get a massive opportunity in October to get a feature on ASAP Mob's project, Cozy Tapes Volume 1, alongside both Offset and Lil Yachty, which of course were giant names at that point. This would also form a connection with ASAP Ferg, with him and Tokyo actually having 5 collaborations together over the entire span of his career, with him finally finishing off 2016 with one final project alongside his brother called 24 Hours in Tokyo. Very clever name. So with 2016 now behind him and 2017 on the horizon, you would only think that Tokyo was going to get bigger and bigger. And while he definitely stayed pretty consistent, I would say that 2016 was really his peak. And this mostly came down to the fact that he would welcome his first child into the world in February 2017, meaning that his priorities were now completely different. He now was no longer able to screw around, go to parties, and do shows nonstop, and instead, well, would have to be a father. And on top of that, Tokyo never ended up signing a deal with a major label, which at that point was kind of important to do if you really wanted to get to that next level. I mean, after all, Tokyo's a pretty subdued guy. He kind of has a quiet personality, meaning that he's not really able to push himself on Instagram with any crazy antics, which puts a lot of weight on his music to perform super well. And while it would still do pretty decent with his fan base, he would never really reach the same heights that he was at in 2016. But that doesn't mean that 2017 was a failure by any means, because he would immediately get on the XXL freshman list for that year, which honestly probably 1 year too late, but XXL is always late on everybody, so let's give him the W. Not to mention he was part of a cypher with Playboy Cardi, XXXTentacion, and to a lesser extent Ugly God, which was a pretty big deal, although at that point, honestly MadeinTYO was probably bigger than all of them. I mean, both Cardi and X were really starting to take off at that point, but Tokyo already had a couple platinum hits at that point, and the two of them were really only starting to find their fame. However, that wouldn't stay true for very long, as Tokyo spent most of 2017 on tour, trying to make as much money as he could to support his child. The two biggest things that he did this year was probably getting on a remix with Famous Dex on the track With Ya Bitch, which got a music video on Lyrical Lemonade, as well as doing an interview on Mass Appeal. Like I said, he eventually hopped on the trend. However, despite his public persona taking a back seat while he was on tour, people were definitely still very hyped for the next project that he was going to drop, and they were excited to see what he was going to do with his debut album. And as soon as 2018 kicked off, he would immediately reinsert himself by getting 2 Lyrical Lemonade videos back to back, with one called Too Quick, as well as him getting on a feature with Mac Miller on a track called Learn How to Watch, which actually had a cameo from Lil Xan as well, which is kind of a funny connection. And I gotta give it to Tokyo, it's actually pretty impressive that he was still as big as he was by 2018. I mean, after all, most people who blew up all the way back in 2015 at this point were old news, but MadeinTYO was at least maintaining his overall relevancy, and as a new generation of fans came in, he was able to gather their attention the same way that he did only a few years prior. And in August of 2018, he ended up dropping his next viral hit, going by the name of Ned Flanders, of course featuring ASAP Ferg, being their third collaboration together. And while once again this track never ended up hitting the Billboard Hot 100, it still was a pretty big viral hit online, with a lot of people playing it during the summer of 2018. I mean, I remember hearing it everywhere, although I had no idea that it was actually made by MadeinTYO. I actually thought it was an Egovert song, which goes to show that, well, his persona really wasn't that strong, but his music still hit. And the success of this song would finally lead into his debut album, which was called Sincerely Tokyo, which, while not really having any massive hits on it, did include one track called Chuck E. Cheese, which also seemed to be pretty big online. But despite how much people were fucking with his music online, he just couldn't seem to get himself back into the mainstream consciousness. But don't count him out yet, because in 2019, MadeinTYO would finally return to the Billboard Hot 100 with a song that everybody loves, with Tokyo landing a feature on Chance the Rapper's infamous project The Big Day on the most infamous song off of that entire project, going by the name of Hot Shower. Now, unpopular opinion, this is probably going to be the most controversial thing that I've ever said on this channel, but I actually think that Hot Shower is not that bad. I mean, is it a good song? No. Is it kind of annoying? Yes. But is it dog shit? No. And honestly, I think the worst parts of the song really come from Chance and his annoying delivery. I think when it comes to MadeinTYO and DaBaby, they actually did a pretty solid job. And even if you don't like the song, you do have to admit that it's pretty impressive that he was able to get on this big of a project this late into his career. I mean, we're talking about a guy who blew up all the way back in 2015. DaBaby had only recently blown up and become a big star. So for the two of them to collab on a song together is a pretty big deal. I mean, you wouldn't see somebody like Little Candy Pain or Diego Money or Uno the Activist or Thousand Band Fawny get on a song with DaBaby, so we have to give MadeinTYO props. However, you would think after this one last win that MadeinTYO would finally fade away. I mean, after all, by 2019, the SoundCloud wave was becoming old news. I mean, most of the people who were popping out of it at that point were either jokes, memes, clones, or people that were only fucked with because they were interesting when it came to the way that they looked and acted and not really for their music. And once 2020 rolled around, things really changed. I mean, people were no longer able to go out and do performances. There was a lot of people stuck in the house. TikTok was starting to blow up. A whole new generation of kids were starting to listen to music. And at that point, SoundCloud was all but dead. And it's kind of crazy to see how rigid that cutoff really was, because usually when a new decade begins, the type of music that was popular in the prior decade will at least try to continue to exist for a couple years before finally falling out of favor. I mean, think about how big hair metal was in the 80s, but by the time the 90s rolled around, it continued to try to exist until about 1994 before being completely killed by grunge. But when it came to SoundCloud rap, 2020, 3 months into it, dead, completely cut off. Which meant a lot of these artists that were basically coasting through the end of the SoundCloud wave now had to reinvent themselves and figure out how they were going to operate with this new TikTok landscape, and many rappers would become casualties to this new wave. And I would say, unfortunately, TOKIO was one of them. He would have one more hit in the new decade, which was a song with both Nicki Minaj and ASAP Ferg, but let's be honest, that only became a hit based off of the name value of the other two artists. It didn't really have a whole lot to do with TOKIO. And that can be shown by the fact that when his sophomore album dropped, despite having really amazing features by the likes of Ty Dolla $ign, Lucky, and even Wiz Khalifa, the project didn't really gain that much attention. Now, part of me feels like that's because the cover art was just straight up not good for this type of music. I mean, I remember seeing this project get promoted back in 2020, and I decided not to click on it because I thought it was going to be some sort of artsy-fartsy kind of Deftones type of project, not somebody making Cardi type music. I mean, I get the aesthetic, his name is MadeinTYO. I'm guessing this art was probably based off of some sort of famous Japanese artist, but it doesn't really translate to a mainstream audience, and I feel like it hurt the project more than it helped it, but that's just my opinion. And the only other big thing that he did in 2020 was give Tokyo's Revenge a shout out that would help to set his career off, but considering where that guy ended up, he probably would rather we forget about that. So let's move on to 2021. And honestly, this is where we start to enter the dead zone when it comes to his career. Not only was his music not doing that well, he wasn't really dropping at all. I mean, he dropped one small mixtape during this time, but it wasn't really something that was pushed all that heavily by him or his camp. He ended up shaving his head, getting this crazy face tattoo. He was starting to talk about how he was more interested in being a producer than a rapper, and really throughout 2022 and 2023, we didn't see a whole lot from TOKIO. However, by 2024, there would be another news story about him and his brother, although not for the best of reasons. Basically, they wanted to get back on No Jumper after not being on there for years, and Adam22 basically told them, sorry, you guys aren't that popping anymore. I'm really not that interested in doing it. So 24 Hours would decide to go on a different podcast and talk shit about them, leading Adam to retaliate with this video right here.
I seen a clip of this dude, 24 Hours, who, if you don't know, he's like MadeinTYO's big brother. I interviewed him in like 2015 or 2016 or some shit, and I seen a podcast clip of him complaining and basically calling me out and acting like I'm a piece of shit because he asked me to have him on the podcast, I don't know, maybe a year ago, and I didn't respond. He goes and does this podcast the other day on Back on Fig, for the record, so you can look it up. MadeinTYO and 24 Hours, aka Royce Rizzy, that's his old name. And I didn't respond because I just didn't really want to like have to tell. It would have been like the saddest interview ever. And I really did you a favor by not doing that interview. And you sound like a total fucking bozo going on some other podcast and talking shit about. Tell him that the reason why I didn't think it was a good time to interview him was because he was like unbelievably cold, like zero.
And while a lot of people were shitting on Adam for making this video, which I do understand, his reputation really isn't all that great, I do kind of understand where he's coming from. When TOKIO was at the height of his career, he had no interest in doing a No Jumper interview, but now that he's pretty well fallen off, now he wants to get on the platform, it definitely seems a little bit scummy. And besides that one somewhat viral moment, I guess you could call it, he basically continued on the same way, producing songs for different artists, most likely ghostwriting and making a bag off of that, and dropping his own solo projects to very little fanfare. One weird thing that I noticed from him is that he did a Ask Me Anything on Reddit in 2021 where he talked about this new platform that he was dropping music on called Adidas, I think. Adidas? I don't really know what it's called, but apparently it's some sort of open source cryptocurrency NFT thing. And he was even openly talking about his crypto investments in the AMA, which honestly, I mean, you know, whatever. Cryptocurrency is something that exists. He has a lot of money. He's probably trying to invest it in the right way. Not really sure if this is shady or not. Maybe somebody can tell me, but yeah. Just another weird thing that Tokyo did during the 2020s. And with all that said, that's basically the story of MadeinTYO. Like I said before, he had a rapid rise, but the fall was more gradual. And I think this is the reason that people don't really talk about Tokyo that much anymore, because unlike somebody like Smoke Perp who fell off in a very embarrassing and theatrical way, Tokyo just kind of faded into the background, kind of doing what he loved without caring too much about being famous anymore. And honestly, you kind of gotta respect him for that. I mean, is he as popular as he was back in 2016? No, definitely not. Will he ever reach those heights again? No, probably not. But the man is definitely doing what he loves. I mean, he was able to capitalize on a moment in time that most other artists weren't able to. He never got lost in drugs or partying or being with a bunch of women. He ended up marrying the girl that he was with before he ever got popping, having a son with her, and now he basically just lives a chill life producing music and, well, being a father. And honestly, when it comes to a SoundCloud rapper, I really think that's the best ending that you can get. I mean, it takes a very certain type of person to remain successful and popular and famous for years and years and years. And if you don't have that personality type, you need to realize that your moment of fame is going to be just that, a moment. And I think Tokyo realized that more than most of his contemporaries, realizing that he wasn't going to be famous forever, so he took advantage of everything that he could, made as much money as he was able to, and now he's able to chill for the rest of his life, producing music and, well, raising his son. So honestly, shout out to MadeinTYO, shout out to 24 Hours. Both of them have a very interesting story. And while I know it's not as sad and pathetic and entertaining as most of the SoundCloud rapper fall off stories, I still thought that it was an interesting one to tell. So if you guys enjoyed the video and you want to see more like this, definitely let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel. We're almost to 30K, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.